March 7th, 1965. The American Dream and the American Negro by James Baldwin. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. It would seem to me that the question before the House is a proposition horribly loaded, that one's response to that question depends on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. The white South African or Mississippi sharecropper or Alabama sheriff has at bottom a system of reality which compels them really to believe when they face the Negro that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. We speak about expense. There are several ways of addressing oneself to some attempt to find out what that word means here. From a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially in the South, could not conceivably be what they are if it had not been, and this is still so, for cheap labor. I am speaking very seriously, and this is not an overstatement. I picked cotton. I carried it to the market. I built the railroad under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has still today so very much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This in the land of the free, the home of the brave. None can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady or a girl at the Western Union desk. She doesn't know quite whom she is dealing with, by which I mean, if you are not part of a town, and if you are a northern nigger, it shows in a million ways. She simply knows that it is an unknown quantity and she wants nothing to have to do with it. You have to wait a while to get your telegram. We've all been through it. By the time you get to be a man, it is fairly easy to deal with. But what happens to the poor white man's, the poor white woman's mind? It is this. They have been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible some of their lives may be, and no matter what disaster overtakes them, there is one consolation, like heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. I suggest that of all the terrible things that could happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to the white Southerner is in some ways much worse than what has happened to the Negroes there. Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be dismissed as a total monster. I am sure he loves his wife and children and likes to get drunk. One has to assume he is a man like me. But he does not know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun and use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breasts. What happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. Their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color. This is not being done 100 years ago, but in 1965, and in a country which is pleased with what we call prosperity, with a certain amount of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of freedom in the world. If it were white people being murdered, the government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had the 15th Amendment nearly 100 years ago. If it was not honored then, I have no reason to be believing that the Civil Rights Bill will be honored now. The American soil is full of corpses of my ancestors through 400 years and at least 3 wars. Why is my freedom, my citizenship in question now? What one begs American people to do for all sakes is simply to accept our history. It seems to me, when I watch Americans in Europe, that what they don't know about Europeans is what they don't know about me. They're not trying to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They did not know that they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular man and this particular woman were human beings. They walked over them with the same sort of bland ignorance and condescension, the charm and cheerfulness with which they had patted me on the head and which made them upset when I was upset. When I was brought up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history and that neither had I. I was a savage about whom the least said the better, who had been saved by Europe and who had been brought to America. Of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. These were the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you went out of Harlem, the whole world agreed. What you saw was much bigger, whiter, cleaner, safer. The garbage was collected, the children were happy. You could go back home, and it would seem, of course, that this was an act of God. You belonged where white people put you. It's only since World War II that there has been a counter-image in the world. That image has not come about because of any legislation by any American government, but because Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and Africans had to be dealt with in a way they had never been dealt with before. This gave the American Negro, for the first time, a sense of himself not as a savage. It has created and will create a great many conundrums. One of the things the white world does not know, but I think I know, is that Black people are just like everybody else. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. Unless we can establish some kind of dialogue between those people who enjoy the American dream and those people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. This is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room and we are all civilized. We can talk to each other, at least on certain levels, so that we can walk out of here assuming that the measure of our politeness has some effect on the world. I remember when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America, we might have a Negro president. That sounded like a very emancipated statement to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard. They did not hear the laughter and bitterness and scorn with which this statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday, and now he's already on his way to the presidency. We were here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years If you are good, we may let you become president. Perhaps I can be reasoned with, but I don't know. Neither does Martin Luther King. None of us knows how to deal with people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says, and don't believe entirely anything I or Martin say. You can't blame them. It seems to me that the city of New York has had, for example, Negroes in it for a very long time. The city of New York was able in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, to tear down buildings and raise great new ones, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects, mainly in the ghettos, for the Negroes. And of course, the Negroes hate it. The children can't bear it. They want to move out of the ghettos. If American pretensions were based on more honest assessments of life, it would not mean for Negroes that when someone says urban renewal, some Negroes are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it means now. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. Until that moment comes when we, the Americans, are able to accept the fact that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity, that we need each other, that I am not a ward of America, I am not an object of missionary charity, I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment comes, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream.
Because the people who are denied participation in it, by their
very presence, they will wreck it.
And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
I'm Paul Outlaw for This Way Out. Thanks for listening and watching.